A warm welcome to everybody. I am Karen Donfried, and for those of you whom I haven't met yet, I'm the new president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And it is great to see such a strong turnout today for the launch of a new GMF series called Transatlantic Talks. I could not be more delighted than to have Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, kicking off this series for us. Just a few words about the series. What we want to do with GMF Transatlantic Talks is bring together senior government officials from both sides of the Atlantic and pair them with a senior journalist from the other side of the Atlantic to discuss the issues that are most relevant to the transatlantic community. And today, I'm also happy to welcome Ed Luce of the Financial Times to complete our transatlantic duo. These conversations will all be on the record, and you can follow the conversation on Twitter at #GMFTtalk. And because there was so much interest in today's event, we are live streaming it simultaneously on the GMF website. So kudos to Tori and Ed. The second installment of Transatlantic Talks will be taking place in the second half of July and is likely to preview the NATO summit. We'll keep you posted on that. Now, there are two reasons why I'm particularly delighted to welcome Assistant Secretary Nuland to kick off the series. First, on the substance of U.S. policy toward Europe, she understands, like no other, the breadth and depth of transatlantic relations because she lives it every day. We have such a full agenda with our European allies, from the challenges posed by the crisis in Ukraine to the opportunity of a transatlantic trade and investment partnership, from the P5+1 negotiations in Iran to the NATO summit in Wales. Assistant Secretary Nuland traveled with the President to Poland to celebrate the 25th anniversary of free and fair elections, to Belgium for the G7 summit, and to France to mark the 70th anniversary of D-Day. She attended the inauguration of Ukraine's new president. She is on the diplomatic front line of the relationship. The second reason I'm so honored to have her here is because she was my closest partner in the interagency in my old job at the National Security Council, and it simply means a great deal to me to have her here. Since I no longer see her in the White House Situation Room, I wanted to invite her to the GMF conference room. By way of introduction, Assistant Secretary Nuland has a distinguished record of achievement as a career Foreign Service officer, as noted in the full bio you received. Before assuming her current position, she served as the State Department's spokesperson, and prior to that held many influential posts, including as U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO. I opened my New York Times this morning to read that she is one of the country's toughest and most experienced diplomats. She is truly one of the best. Thank you so much for being here, Toria. And as I mentioned, the other part of this duo is Ed Luce, our moderator. Ed is the Washington correspondent and columnist for the Financial Times. We couldn't have asked for a more thoughtful and skilled moderator, and we're grateful to you for joining us today as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the two of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Karen. First things first, I believe that Germany, Portugal, it's 1-0. And
it is sort of a human rights abuse. We're doing this on top of the game, don't you think?
Yeah,
I really
I think that's well put.
That.
But apparently there are a lot of German colleagues of Karen's have had urgent work appointments.
Absolutely.
They've been called away for, so we should just get that out of the way. It's a real pleasure and honor to join you here, Ambassador. I'd like to get into Ukraine, but let me just kick off with a broader question, since you are, covering the whole of Europe for the administration. Shortly after you were confirmed last year, you gave a big speech at the Atlantic Council, where you called for a transatlantic renaissance on energy, a Europe whole and free, all sorts of areas of cooperation, and of course TTIP. Now, things have obviously not been going brilliantly there, not because you were confirmed in the position, but because the world is the world. Talk to us a little bit about how you see 6-7 months on, how you see the state of transatlantic relations.
Well, thanks, Ed. But first, let me just thank Karen. I'm delighted to be here so early in her tenure, which I know will be brilliant for GMF and brilliant for the transatlantic relationship. I'm just desperately sad that I don't work with you every day, but this is a little bit of compensation. And thanks to colleagues for coming out today, and particularly to all the ambassadors who are here. So the theory of the case in September, when I was sworn in, and then in November when I gave the speech, was that now that transatlantic economies, both sides of the Atlantic, are starting to recover, we need to reinvest in each other. We need to take the relationship to the next 21st century step, and TTIP being the prime engine was the focal point to try to do for our economic relationship through TTIP what we've done for 70 years on the security side through NATO, and have that inform a stronger transatlantic energy policy, a more unified approach to Russia, at that point continuing to encourage the best and blunt the worst was the theory, and finally finish the map of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And as you recall, in the fall there was all this hope about the Eastern Partnership cementing Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, and then of course we ended up very quickly in the greatest challenge to European security that we've seen at least since the Balkan Wars. So what I would say there is that if anything, this challenge that we now have to our fundamental values, to Helsinki principles, to the territorial integrity and sovereignty of a major European nation of 46 million people, makes it all the more important that we not only be unified in support of Ukraine's right to choose its future, of Ukraine's right to have what so many of the rest of us have, democracy and choice and prosperity, but that all the other things that we need to do are equally important. The saliency and vital necessity of being more secure as an energy community, more diverse as an energy community, is certainly underscored by this crisis. The importance of getting back to reinvesting in hard security is all the more important, and putting some of that growth into ensuring that we can defend our space if necessary, and that everybody knows that NATO territory in particular is inviolable. But it also makes clear that the hard work of a NATO, of a Europe whole, free, and at peace is far from finished, and that there are challenges to it, and that there are enemies of it. And therefore, if we truly believe it, we've got to invest in it every day, even as together we do global work together, and we defend peace and security around the world as well.
Let me pick up on the unity point. I believe sometime in the next 10 days or so, the French will be training 400 or so Russian sailors to do with the sale of the Mistral amphibious naval ship. That's the kind of thing that undermines unity and cooperation, isn't it? Given your very, very difficult task in dealing with Russia at this point, the French are actually training Russian soldiers, Russian troops, in the use of new equipment.
Well, we've certainly made clear, we made clear well before the Ukraine crisis that we had large questions about whether Mistral was the right thing to be sending and about the deal. We have not been shy about saying that we think the timing is certainly wrong, particularly given where it's going and the capabilities that it will have. So we will continue to make that point. You know the French arguments, that they are in the midst of recovery themselves, that this is an employment platform. I think what's important is that we continue this dialogue about whether it makes any sense to send it as they continue to make the decisions, and before they make the final decision whether a transfer makes sense.
And you were of course last month, or earlier this month, in Normandy, and as a guest with President Obama of President Hollande, and to your chagrin and those of many others, President Putin was one of the invitees. What kind of impact did that have, the Normandy meetings, the meetings around the Normandy anniversary, on the efforts you're trying to push here of getting a unified Western response to the Russian actions?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to underscore that there was not a lot of controversy about whether the president of Russia should be present at the commemoration of D-Day. I mean, he is the president, the people of Russia and the people of Ukraine and the people of Belarus and the people of that entire space suffered massively during World War II and made a incredible contribution to the fact that we all live freely today. So President Putin was there to commemorate and to mark the contributions of Russians to the victory in World War II. And that said, there was a concerted effort to minimize the engagement. But one thing that did come out of the Normandy opportunity, the fact that everybody was there together, as you saw, was that the new president of Ukraine, who at that point was just President-elect Poroshenko, who had very much been hoping for an opportunity to see Putin bilaterally, had an opportunity to sit down with him in the company of Chancellor Merkel, in the company of President Hollande, to pitch him on joining in a peace and reconciliation plan for the eastern part of Ukraine, and to see if President Putin could be enticed into working with him on de-escalation. And out of that very quick 15-minute conversation came some trilateral talks, Russia, Ukraine, with the OSCE facilitating some further efforts to settle the gas dispute. So from that perspective, through the midwifery, if you will, of European allies, the two leaders of these very important countries at least had a chance to see if they could start working together. Now, obviously, events since then have been very difficult with the transfer of Russian equipment into Ukraine, with the shoot down of the IL-76, with the concomitant anger in Ukraine, the attacks on the Russian embassy over the weekend. So.
Let me pick you up on that specifically. On Friday, I think the State Department said if Russian incursion into suspected Russian incursion into eastern and south Ukraine continued, that there would be costs attached to that. Now, of course, this weekend there's been a dramatic escalation in some respects. You have the plane being shot down. You also have today Gazprom shutting off gas supplies to the Ukraine. A, is this an escalation? And B, what will be the costs to this action?
Well, again, Ed, the way we have approached this all the way through this Ukraine crisis has been sort of a four-pillar approach, if you might. First of all, to try to help Ukraine succeed, help it have a democratic chance, help it have an economic chance. Second, to make it cost for Russia when she destabilizes, whether it was Crimea, whether it's what we're seeing in the East. Third, though, to provide an opportunity, an off-ramp, as President Obama likes to say, for Russia if it will begin to change course and work with Ukraine and work with all of us on stabilizing the country. And then lastly, to protect NATO space, to ensure reassurance for all of those NATO allies who live closest, to ensure we are on land, sea, and air, making clear that NATO space is inviolable. So in the context of the conversation that we've been having with Russia, at every stage, there have been tests put forward to see if Russia would de-escalate. So the April 17th Geneva Agreement, and when that wasn't adhered to, there were more sanctions imposed by both the US and Europe. Then on May 2nd, when Chancellor Merkel came to Washington, she and the President made clear that if the Russian Federation destabilized Ukraine such that the elections couldn't go forward, that there would be more sanctions. We believe that unity had a profound effect, even as not everybody in Donetsk and Luhansk was able to vote. The vast majority of the country could. So during that Normandy week, just before we got to Normandy, the G7 gathered. The meeting that was supposed to be a G8 in Sochi happened as a G7 in Brussels. And it was in that meeting that the G7 leaders agreed again on what the next offer to Russia to de-escalate would be and what the costs would be if it didn't. And if you look at the G7 agreement, essentially the G7 called on Russia first and foremost to recognize the results of the election. As you know, Russia had been saying that the authorities in Kyiv were illegitimate. Second, to break with separatists and make clear that it expects them to lay down their arms and accept this peace plan. And then third, to help close the border. So that was the agreement as of a week ago. And since then, led by Ukraine, there's been an effort to test whether Russia would de-escalate. They did. There has been contact between President Poroshenko and President Putin along the lines that would constitute recognition. They're dealing with each other as presidents. There has been this negotiation on a peace plan, but as you say, concurrently with that, there has been further efforts to aid and abet separatists in this extremely dangerous way, with tanks transferred, with rocket launcher systems transferred, with a man pad used to shoot down the IL-76. So it's a very mixed picture. And President Obama, when we were in Europe, made clear that we would not wait months to decide whether Russia had changed course, that it would be a matter of 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or 4 weeks before we agree as a transatlantic community if more costs are in order. So we are evaluating that on a daily basis and making clear, as we did publicly over the weekend, and frankly as Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande did in their phone call with President Putin, that if he doesn't change course, there will be costs.
No Western official has been more involved with this than you in the last few months, and in different ways the last few years. How could you describe it as anything else than a sharp deterioration?
No, there's no question that we've had a serious deterioration on the ground over the last week.
Would it be right to call this a sort of stealth de facto Russian occupation, invasion of eastern Ukraine? And what would you describe as what is happening now in eastern Ukraine?
We have most of Donetsk Oblast and half of Luhansk Oblast with major areas under the control of these self-proclaimed separatists. They are receiving weapons and support and organization and money from the Russian Federation, and that has not stopped. The other half of the picture is that for the first time Russia has sent a negotiator who is working full-time in Kyiv. So, what are we seeing here? Are we seeing an effort to put facts on the ground while negotiating to get a better deal, or is it cynical? I think we haven't assessed fully yet.
Let's talk a bit more broadly about the European cooperation picture. The old adage is that when you want to pick up the phone and call Europe, you don't know who to call. But I think in most people's eyes, and I'd be interested to hear in your opinion, it's pretty obvious nowadays who you do call. It's Angela Merkel, it's the Chancellor of Germany. What kind of conversation and cooperation are you having with Germany on this, and to what degree does the difference between the domestic debates in Germany about Putin, where he's got quite a lot of support, and the United States, where clearly he doesn't, to what degree is that a problem in forging a common German, US, and therefore more broadly European US front on this issue?
Well, the interesting thing, Ed, is that even in Germany, Putin and his reputation have taken a serious hit over the last 6 months. If you look at the polling across the country, I mean, the threat to peace and stability and the chewing off of a piece of Ukraine undercuts every value that modern Germany holds dear, starting with the Helsinki principles. So you do feel that across the body politic, I think. The problem is that it's the what is to be done, what's the right amount of carrot versus stick. So more broadly, I would certainly agree with you that when the U.S. and Germany agree, and this is certainly President Obama's view in his close relationship with Chancellor Merkel, we can influence the conversation across Europe very powerfully. So it's important that we stay absolutely in lockstep. And then more traditionally, US, UK, France, Germany, Italy, and the EU structure. So we work also very intensely in that Quint plus EU structure, and we have throughout on Ukraine, and then adding Canada, our G7 partner, who's been very strong. So that's been very effective, both in terms of plotting a clear path, as we say, this off-ramp, this diplomatic opportunity at every stage, while also coordinating the costs, the sanctions, the isolation.
And do you have confidence that this so-called third round of sanctions, if what's happening in Ukraine continues, that a third round of sanctions with bite can be agreed?
I think we are well aligned now on what a next round of economic sanctions would look like, in addition to continuing to look for individuals who one would sanction, whether they're the folks who influence Putin or whether they're the separatists themselves. We're now working on a series of sanctions in the energy sector, in the banking sector, in the defense sector, which would essentially, without getting into it in too much detail before decisions are made, exact a cost on Russia in terms of the next generation of investment, the next generation of technology, those things that we excel in and that Russia needs if it's going to grow and get out of what is now a near recession state, according to the IMF.
I can't resist asking you a slightly more parochial question about Britain, since we're talking about transatlantic ties, who lost 2-1 to Italy, unfortunately, last Friday.
Sorry, UK
colleagues. It wasn't Britain, it was England.
Yeah.
The UK has traditionally been the largest defence spender amongst your allies across the Atlantic. And I think it still is the largest, but it's a relatively shrinking pie in that pretty much everybody's now below 2%. But I think the average, the ex-US average for NATO is about 1.4%. It's dropped quite sharply. How big a factor is this for you in your conversations with the British and other key NATO allies? How big a concern is it for you about the longer term strength of the transatlantic alliance?
Well, there's no question that across the alliance, we have to reverse the slide in defense spending, and we now need to make the security investment, as this NATO reassurance mission makes clear. For a long time, we were focused on one half of NATO's mission, our expeditionary export of security, but now we need security in our own space, and that means we have to, as we say in colloquial American, walk and chew gum at the same time, and that takes money. So in the context of the Wales summit that the UK will host on September 4 and 5, the NATO summit, President Obama's been strong with every ally, including the UK, that who is under 2%, that we need to make a contribution. We need to make it clear at Wales that that slide is being reversed. But as the host, the UK is very clearly thinking about what it can do itself within its defense budget, and we very much welcome that, because we depend on the United Kingdom to be a full spectrum defense ally globally, not just in transatlantic space.
You also to some degree depend on the UK, also Germany and others, for strong trade agreements. And TTIP isn't looking quite as vibrant and as healthy as it might have when you took your job. Now, clearly, a lot of Europeans would say this is because the Obama administration hasn't got fast-track negotiating authority, and this is a key element in any previous big trade deal has been the US president having that authority. How would you characterize the health of TTIP at this stage?
Well, when TTIP was launched, there was obviously a lot of euphoria on both sides of the Atlantic from communities who've wanted this for a long time and who've thought that we were behind the curve in not having free trade between the biggest democracies and most vibrant ones on both sides of the Atlantic. So there was a lot of enthusiasm and excitement. I think as with any trade agreement, as with any hard negotiation, when you start getting down to the fine print and start having to do the horse trading, you get to that stage where the reality of how complicated this is, even as it's important, becomes clear, and then the constituencies who may be scared of change come out. So that's a stage that we're at now, but I think we have generally the economics are so powerful on both sides of the Atlantic, and they're particularly powerful for our large companies on both sides who really understand that they will be able to create more jobs, grow their businesses. But now increasingly we are spreading the word among medium-sized businesses who maybe, if they were in Europe, only thought about themselves as continental. If they were in the United States, never thought in Kansas that they might be selling in Paris. And we're starting to create new energy that way. But this is going to be, we have, I would say, easily another year of negotiating. So I think as the elements of the deal become clearer, as people begin to see the benefits, that argument is going to make itself, but we also have to dispel a lot of myths on both sides of the Atlantic. With regard to trade authority, as you know, we also have been negotiating a free trade agreement with Asia. That one is close to complete. That I think we anticipate that the authorities that we need from Congress would cover both. So that'll be a conversation that we'll have likely with the Congress well before we get to the period that TTIP would have to go up for ratification. So both of these can be engines for making the argument, and we expect that there's going to be a lot of U.S. business lobbying for both treaties with the Congress when the time comes.
I must ask, since we're at the German Marshall Fund, in terms of European reaction to the Edward Snowden stuff and the NSA's activities, the German one has probably been the strongest, or amongst the most significant at any rate. Mm-hmm. Is that a factor in the conversations you have about TTIP and other issues? Has it polluted to some degree the relationship? I'm sorry, I'm a journalist. I know I'm making the world sound very depressing. But this is my
well, I'm a diplomat and I'm paid to be an optimist.
Right.
So,
yeah. So we'll meet
otherwise,
in the
we'd just all put our pillows over our heads and go back to sleep. Right? I think very quickly, through wisdom in many European governments, there was sort of a hard line drawn between our need to manage our intelligence relationship appropriately and the fact that we both need this transatlantic trade and investment partnership agreement. So, and Chancellor Merkel, in fact, led the charge in saying, we will work hard with the Americans, we will work hard as a transatlantic community to have a better understanding going forward on intelligence, but we will also have TTIP because we need both.
Mm-hmm. Shortly I'll go to some audience questions, but let me ask a couple more questions about the broader relationship, and also where the administration stands. Clearly Iraq, as you alluded to earlier, is taking up a lot of bandwidth for very understandable reasons at the moment. A couple of months ago people were talking about Ukraine and the annexation, Russia's annexation of Crimea as being the biggest challenge to Western unity since the end of the Cold War. Now you're hearing voices saying that the collapse in Iraq and Al-Qaeda's advance in that region is as big a challenge. Russia is a big factor in both of these. Mm-hmm. Well, it's the factor in one, but a big factor in the Iraq picture too, and the Syria-Iraq situation. To what extent is what's happening there crowding out your bandwidth within the administration to argue the Ukraine case? Because there's only a certain number of hours in the day, and a president is a human being. How much of a struggle is it to keep Ukraine on the front burner in a broader Middle Eastern situation like this?
Well, obviously the challenge that we face from extremists and Al-Qaeda throughout the belt from Syria to Iraq is a threat not just to the United States but also to the transatlantic community, and we talk a lot with our European partners about foreign fighters in Syria, and all these things are connected. but so too is the threat to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of individual European nations. So we have to, as we have so many times before in our history, manage both. And we've got to be able to have, with our major allies and with the EU as an institution and at NATO, a conversation about both things. And I think we're doing that. In the Ukraine context, I think, as I said, we have a framework for working that has been established over the past 6 months, so it's a matter of ensuring that we stick to that, that if we cannot get de-escalation, that we ensure that costs are applied. In the Iraq situation, we're just at the beginning of the conversation, not only bilaterally with Iraq, not only with Gulf partners, with our ally Turkey, but also in the transatlantic community about how we can all concert effort and get back to peace, stability, multi-ethnic, confederation democracy in Iraq, because it's obviously a centerpiece, and all of that will just flow north if we can't get it under control.
Karen mentioned that she opened her New York Times this morning and saw a piece about you and your husband, Robert Kagan, that described you as one of the toughest. Was it one of the toughest or most hawkish? Well, I opened the same New York Times anyway.
Was the H word in there?
That was generally.
I don't know. I just
the
remember reading about
most experienced, toughest and most
toughest
experienced.
and most
Nothing
experienced.
about hawk.
the most embarrassing part of that piece was that, now everybody knows my husband lets my son eat Cocoa Puffs. It's his fault, by the way.
I was shocked. I was shocked to read that. I thought it would have been Weetabix.
Yeah, exactly.
The reputation you have within this administration and in Washington more generally is that you are the sort of spearhead of its response on Ukraine in particular, but more generally you are a tough voice. Is that a fair characterization of your voice inside the interagency process, inside the meetings?
I don't think anybody can really ever hold a mirror up to themselves. I'll let others characterize. But I am proud, along with Karen and many people in this room, to have devoted much of my life and career to a Europe whole, free, and at peace. I see this current challenge as very much in that context. I've also spent a lot of my career working for and hoping for a more democratic, peaceful, integrated Russia, a more European Russia, and I won't stop working for that either, because I think it's profoundly in the United States' interest, it's profoundly in the transatlantic interest, and it's what the Russian people themselves deserve, to live in a country that is open and free and provides opportunities of speech and employment and the way you live for every one of its citizens.
I have many more questions on Ukraine, but I'm going to resist the temptation
right.
to try and trip you up and make news and open up to the audience some questions. Please identify yourself. You've got your hand up. Identify yourself. I think we do have microphones. If you could identify yourself first.
Sure. David Kramer with Freedom House Astoria. Thanks very much for doing this. Thanks for all you're doing in your government service, particularly now.
Thanks to you for wearing the colors today.
Two questions, Ukraine-related and Russia-related. Lethal assistance to Ukraine, is that a possibility? Can you foresee a scenario where the U.S. moves ahead with lethal assistance to Ukraine to help it defend itself? And secondly, on sanctions, and I appreciate what you said about talking to the Europeans about a third round, but the sanctions have been done differently. The lists have not matched up identically. Is there a possibility that the U.S. would move ahead unilaterally, even though the President has stressed the importance of unity, U.S. and EU? Thanks. Spoken to the microphone.
So first, on security support for Ukraine, as you know, we have provided some $18 million so far in non-lethal assistance to Ukraine, including quite a bit of border assistance, which is making a significant difference now as the Ukrainians try to close that border. As the president said when he met with then President-elect, now President Poroshenko, in Warsaw, was it only a week ago? I guess it was only, a week and a half ago. Now that there is an elected president in Ukraine, and elected with a strong mandate, The U.S. will now move on to what we call train and assist with the Ukrainian security services. The first round of that support has begun. We had a 3-star general from EUCOM in Ukraine the same time that I was there a week ago Monday, beginning the process of assessment, identifying those units that we will move forward and train. So that process is underway, and with all that comes with it as we go forward. And we have some money in the budget, and if we get the $1 billion that the President has asked for our European security, some of that will be for Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. With regard to sanctions, I think we have to see, David, it's obviously always preferable, as in all things in the transatlantic space, to move forward with Europe and to move forward with the EU in particular. And some of these sanctions are difficult to do unilaterally because European companies could just backfill if we didn't choose to do it together. So it'll be much, and it's a much stronger message and much stronger deterrent as well to those in Russia who want to keep going if we can do it together. So we're going to work for that, but we have in the past, even on the Ukraine docket, moved before Europe, moved more deeply than Europe, as they conform their regulations, conform their thinking. So I think all options are open in that regard.
Harlan, or should I say the brave man in the pink trousers?
I'm loving it. He is a joyous man in Europe. Yeah, exactly.
Harlan Ullman, Tori, it's always a pleasure, and keep up the good work. My question is about the forthcoming NATO summit. Clearly, what's happened in Ukraine and what's happening in Syria and Iraq have underscored some very, very real weaknesses in NATO's strategy and NATO's position, with which you were well aware when you were our ambassador there. And these could be corrected. On the one hand, the summit has an opportunity to really make some dramatic changes, and as you know, I've been pushing the administration quietly to do that. This would deal with some of these weaknesses that I spoke about, cyber, about the terrorism account, about all the things that have been very difficult to do before. On the other hand, the President has been famously quoted not to do anything stupid. And so therefore, there's a lot of pressure to make the summit just sort of a regular summit without getting into something that really might end up into a fist fight or be controversial. How do you balance both these, the opportunity, which I believe is very real, to make some very significant change, and not necessarily by spending more money, and then the obvious inertia that says, look, let's not really stir up a hornet's nest if we don't have to? How do you come out on that balance?
Well, I think the President himself believes that this Wales summit will probably be the most important NATO summit of his tenure in terms of the need to ensure that the reassurance mission for allies, the Article 5 mission, particularly along the periphery, or along the eastern edge of the alliance, is real, is sustained, is funded. But now, and we're just beginning to think about it as Iraq comes to the fore, also staying strong in terms of our ability to export security. And what will be required isn't clear yet, obviously, but we had already begun scoping in the context of returning combat forces from Afghanistan how to ensure that NATO nonetheless maintained some of these capabilities and commitments that it had employed in Afghanistan. For example, the ability to quickly export security training to others. So we're talking about centralizing that activity at NATO, making it more operational and quick. You could see a number of scenarios where that might be helpful on the other side of the Mediterranean as we move forward. Also, the continuing work that we've tried to do to, even as we increase defense budgets, and as I said, the President's been absolutely clear that he's expecting everybody who's under 2% to reverse that slide and to come to Wales ready to explain how they're going to do it. But in addition, to be more efficient in the way we spend money, to do more with pooling and sharing. We remember in Libya the difficulties we had providing ammunition for F-16s, et cetera. Can we have more ready stocks and things like that so that we can quickly sustain deployments if we need them? So we're looking at all of these things, but I think Ukraine was certainly a wake-up call for the alliance, and this summit, which we thought was largely going to be about turning to the next stage in Afghanistan and thinking about how we didn't lose the sharpness that we had established in that context is now both about traditional defense and expeditionary defense.
Thank you, sir. The gentleman in the front row here.
Thank you. It's İlhan Taner from Turkish Press, Ambassador. My question is on Turkey, your ally, that very close to Ukraine and Syria and Iraq and all that. The question is, how are you seeing or looking to Turkey to partner on these issues, and how do you do this balancing act? On the one hand, Ferdinand was here about all the international universal values. It looks like Turkey is sliding back. Freedom of press, independence of judiciary, go on. How do you balance this? On the one hand, Turkey is sliding back on these issues, or do you see Turkish democracy sliding back or going forward? Thank you.
Well, as Turks have been saying to us for quite some time, the Syria crisis is existential for Turkey, and now the connection between theaters, Syria to Iraq, is even more existential for Turkey, not to mention the horrific taking of hostages at the Turkish consulate in Mosul, and really puts Turkey on the front line of this conflict. So we are, as we have been throughout this, but now even more intensively working together on how we restore peace, how we restore security, how we combat the sectarian aspects of this, which are tearing the fabric of the entire neighborhood, and how we restore a sense of comity and unity, particularly in Iraq, but also meet the threat of growing extremism in Syria and the risk to Turkey itself from that kind of extremism. So that conversation goes on. And of course, in the Ukraine context, Turkey has been on the leading edge of making clear the threat to Crimean Tatars and their way of life and their future, the human rights abuses in Crimea since Russia took over management there. So that conversation continues. But as we always have with Turkey, we believe we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can be absolutely stalwart and unified in the work we have to do on the security side, but we can make the case to Turks of all political persuasions that we need the strongest, healthiest, most vibrant Turkish democracy in order for it to play its full role in global security and as a beacon for majority Muslim countries who want to live democratically. So we will continue to make the case that free media, free expression, protection of NGOs are part and parcel of what makes Turkey strong.
Going forward, or?
Going forward, of course, and particularly in this election period.
The gentleman in the back, and there's another gentleman here, and finally a lady to question the distinguished lady to my left after.
Thank you. On report with the European Parliament in Washington, D.C. Two questions. The first one is, there were elections in the European Parliament 3 weeks ago now. What do you make of these elections in terms of the relation with the US, and what do you expect from this new parliament, especially in terms of the trade agreement or the data privacy issues? Second question is about the process that is now being organized on the election of the selection and election of the new president of the Commission. What do you make of this new process, and what do you think it means for political changes in Europe? Thank you.
Well, on the last question, obviously we are observers in the process. We are watching as the discussions go on. It matters to us that there be strong, committed leadership in the presidency and the Commission. Among all the commissioners, we work incredibly intensely with every single commissioner and with the EU as a whole, and obviously the foreign policy chief. And we have every expectation that as the sweepstakes continues, or as the discussion continues, that a good mix of folks will emerge who we'll begin to work with. You know, you all in Europe suffer through incredibly long and painful American transitions, so it's only fair that we have to suffer through watching how that goes. But what's been gratifying, I think, is that this commission and the structure of the post-Lisbon Europe is such that in our interactions with the current commission, every single one of the commissioners, and Cathy Ashton and President Van Rompuy and Barroso are all saying that they're going to work till the very last second and particularly work closely with us on all the things we do together, whether it's on the security or the economic or the protection of citizens' side. So that's really, really important. You know, we all watched the rise in the anti-Europe vote. How that will translate into the way the Parliament actually works and its attitudes, I think, remains to be seen, and it's not quite clear yet how whether that'll be a block or it won't be a block. But certainly you can expect us to roll up our sleeves very early when these new parliamentarians take their seats and make our case that TTIP's important, that data privacy is important, that you know, safe harbor is important, that working together in European defense and in global defense is important. So we'll be right up there trying to meet and get to know these people and create some sense of transatlantic unity.
Just as a quick follow-up, were you disappointed when Christine Lagarde ruled herself out of the running? Okay, you're not going to answer.
Definitely not for us to pick Europe's next
No,
round of leaders.
Just so that's right. The gentleman in the middle row, and then...
Although I will say on a personal basis, having strong women will be fun.
Yeah.
Hello, Jeff Goldstein from the Open Society Foundations. Following the Russo-Georgian War, the administration of the day went to Congress and requested more than $1 billion in additional appropriations for assistance. Today, in spite of maybe a more existential challenge by Russia in Ukraine, the administration has not gone to Congress to ask for any additional money for assistance to Ukraine, and I'd appreciate if you could explain why that's the case.
That would be false. We, as you will recall, offered a $1 billion loan guarantee to Ukraine that required us to go to the Congress for some $400 million. The president, as I said, the president's $1 billion request for security for Europe will include a substantial chunk for Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. We have taken a lot of the unobligated money from other pots around the world and applied it to Ukraine, an additional almost $100 million this year, and we'll continue to look at the needs going forward.
Madam, for the lady in the second row.
Thank you. Brenda Schaefer, Georgetown University. One of the dramatic aspects of the invasion of Crimea is not the military invasion, but the fact that everything was in place. Under Ukraine's nose, under all of our nose, suddenly the vote's in place in the parliament, there's people there to run the local government, there's a change in all the infrastructure. What is your advice in light of what we discovered, how porous the countries that are bordering Russia are, that have Western orientation? What's your advice to other pro-US leaning countries, Western leaning countries, on how to keep a vibrant civil society, open society in place, but at the same time to protect themselves from Russian infiltration?
Well, I think in some ways there were unique aspects to Crimea because of the long-standing Russian naval presence there and the fact that so much of the economy was geared towards supporting that long-term fleet presence, and that enabled a good amount of cover for the militarization and the preparation of Crimea. So there aren't too many parts of the former Soviet Union that look like that, but there are enough, and they are, for example, in Moldova, they're obviously watching very carefully what happens in Transnistria and whether there's a sort of a rearmament, et cetera. You know, I think what's most important now is that Ukraine have an opportunity to make a success story of itself, that it have the space and the time to clean up the endemic corruption that has also been a wormhole for external influence in Ukraine, as well as a threat to sovereignty, that it have an opportunity to, through the association agreement with Europe and the DCFTA, to really strengthen and revitalize trade ties with countries. At the same time, that if Russia is willing, it be able to trade with Russia, and conceivably, as my boss, Secretary Kerry, likes to say, be a trade bridge between the two. There's no reason why that couldn't be the case, and that Russia couldn't itself see benefits from a Ukraine that has trade-free benefits with Europe. So that's the primary thing. If Ukraine can succeed, then other parts of the former Soviet space that have made different choices, whether it's Abkhazia, whether it's Transnistria, whether it is Minsk, might start to see that countries and citizens can do better when they don't exclude trade both ways, and when they're open and supporting their citizens' rights, et cetera. But I think we have to see. But clearly, I think on the Ukraine side, nobody in Ukraine ever wanted to have a hard militarized border with Russia. That's culturally contradictory, it's economically contradictory. They've lived in, some tension, but always peace for all of the years since the Soviet Union broke up. So I think obviously now it's very difficult, it's very expensive, and it's very painful to have to put up a hard border between two populations that are so culturally intermixed. But if that's what it takes for peace, then that's what Ukraine's going to have to do. So whether other countries are looking at that too, I don't know, but it's unfortunately quite a drain on Ukraine's resources as well, when it should be focusing on economic opportunity.
We have 9 or 10 minutes left for questions, sir, and then.
Thank you. Ed Verona with McLarty Associates. I wonder if you could say a few words about what you think the U.S. private sector might be able to do to help resuscitate the Ukrainian economy in the aftermath of this political crisis, and what the administration might be prepared to do to facilitate that. Something like a mini Marshall Plan or an investors conference, OPEC coverage, U.S. TDA grants to improve energy transportation infrastructure, Ex-Im Bank framework facilities for the oil and gas sector, things of that nature. And are there such plans? And if there are, how can we all get involved?
Or all of the above. First and foremost, we are working with Ukrainians on a big U.S.-Ukraine business and investment promotion conference. We hope that that'll be possible as early as the fall. We're also working intensively with Ukraine on the kinds of things that U.S. business has long asked for, things like e-governance, transparency in procurement, one of the IMF requirements as well, the kinds of things that squeeze corruption out of the system and give U.S. business and European business more confidence that investing in Ukraine is a good bet. I will say that we already have major energy investments, particularly in the area of shale gas, and we hope that those major investments now will bring more subsidiary business as well for American and European companies as we go to the next stage. But if peace can be restored in eastern Ukraine, I think that is where Europe and the US can make a real contribution in terms of smaller investments, diversification of that economy that's always been very dependent on Russia, but also very dependent on sort of Rust Belt industries, and using the incredible know-how of the Ukrainian people to take the economy to a more high-tech place, a more innovative place. So we will be out there recruiting for a Ukraine that is open for business and a clean Ukraine as the Ukrainians take those key steps themselves.
The lady in the middle of the third row back. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Trina Flockhart. I was here at the Transatlantic Academy until Friday, now at the Danish Institute for International Studies. You have referred several times to the tension between crisis management or expeditionary forces in NATO and assurance. And I just wonder whether the strategic concept agreed in 2010, I think one of the great achievements of that was that it actually put those two, plus partnerships for cooperative security, at an equal level. Now that agreement, if it was ever a whole agreement, seems to be sliding now towards assurance and collective defense. And I'm just wondering whether for the Wales summit, whether there will be any more sort of robust talk on the part of the American administration that crisis management is not an optional extra, but something that actually contributes to NATO cohesion.
Thanks in no small part to Danish efforts at the last summit. I would say, I think events in the world, as we see in our newspaper today, are going to demand it. We're going to have strong Article 5 reassurance mission, and we're going to have expeditionary capability, if only to train. Who knows whether we'll be asked to, as NATO, to go into another combat operation, but certainly for training, as the President's made clear with his other big request for training forces on counterterrorism, and I think the times are going to demand it. But that takes us back to the place that we started, which is you can do more with same to a point, but now we have a lot more, and so budgets have to grow. And if we have these ambitions, not only to keep our own space safe, but also to be exporters of security in our own interest, we've got to put money into security and defense. Can't have it for free.
Yes, at the back.
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. I have two unrelated but really short questions. One, how are we going to deal with the fact that our emphasis on democracy in Russia seems now to be taking second place to Putin's appeal to nationalism, and how his popularity has increased? Second issue is more of an alert than anything I expect the answer to. You may know the Europeans are negotiating, quote, economic partnership agreements with Africa, but unlike the US, they threaten to close market access unless they get preferences over US exports. This is going to bite when the TTIP comes back to Congress, because the Black Caucus and other pro-Africans are going to remember what has been done to our competitive position and also with African integration. Can you discuss this matter with the Assistant Secretary for Africa, your counterpart EB and USTR? Because frankly, we really have to slow the Europeans up before they destroy economic integration in Africa, which is so important for our political stability. Thank you, sir. Mayor.
So on the Africa issue, I don't know that I've followed it at the level that you have. So if I understood your point, it is that EU trade agreements with specific African nations would preclude those nations from open trade with others, including us. Is that the point that you're making? Yeah.
Put it very simple terms. I have 50 years in trade, so excuse me for being too detailed. But basically, the Europeans are saying to the Africans, we will not maintain unilateral preferences unless you give us preferences in your market. The US is saying, we want to extend the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a non-reciprocal program, until Africa is sufficiently unified to negotiate as a group. That's the issue to look at. Thank you so much.
Well, it sounds like one that we do have to talk about multilaterally. You know, there are many aspects here as we try to negotiate TTIP with the EU, because we're trying to open the EU system through this. That has trickle-down effect for EU's relationships with other countries, which can be salutary. For example, even in the Moldova context or the Georgia context, when you do DCFTA, it brings those countries into EU standards, which we may be trying to change through TTIP. So there are a lot of wheels within wheels here, but I think in general, what everybody should be seeking, and what we're certainly seeking across the Atlantic, is a more open, tariff-free, fewer barriers environment, and to set that standard globally, if only to combat those who want to go in the other direction, to go back to the 18th and 19th century high walls mercantilism, which isn't good for anybody. On the Russia side, we will never stop speaking out for those in Russia who want to be able to speak their mind, vote for whom they want, and love and live with whom they want. That's been a key part of our approach to Russia, and before Russia, the Soviet Union, and that will not change.
Let me use my privilege as moderator to ask you a final question, because I think
Please.
we've run out of time.
All right.
Looking at what President Putin's been doing and looking at some of the rhetoric he's been employing, and also referring back to the kinds of debates we're having about him in Germany and elsewhere and here, what, in your view, is his bigger aim? Is this to restore, is Ukraine enough? Or is there a larger agenda there to restore the former Russian imperial boundaries? Where do you think the limits of his ambitions lie, in your view?
You know, Ed, in almost every setting where I sit with folks, I'm asked to read Putin's mind and Putin's heart.
You should look
And
into his
it's,
soul.
you know,
It's your job.
it's just not an endeavor that I feel qualified for. What I can say, though, is that as a transatlantic community, we need to continue to do what we've been trying to do for 25 years, arguably 70 years, which is to encourage the best, encourage a more integrated, open, European, democratic Russia who knits together with us, who really lives Helsinki principles, and blunt efforts to take Russia backwards in our own interest, in the interest of European countries, but also in the interests of those Russians who deserve better.
On that note, thank you very much, Ambassador Nuland. For
Thank
joining
you,
us.
Ed.
And let me just thank the ambassadors who are here, colleagues in the think tank community, members of the press, members of the business community. Thank you for joining us and asking great questions. And please join me once more in thanking our terrific duo. Thanks so much.